How to install Tailwind CSS? Tailwind CSS can be installed in two ways. The first one using CDN, or as known Content Delivery Network, which I think, or as recommended by the documentation, you should not use it in the production system. The reason for that, because you cannot modify it, you cannot customize it, as well as the file size of the bundled CSS from the CDN is very large. And normally for any website, you don't need that much of classes to be used in your project. So the file size might be 3.5 megabyte, which is quite large, maybe can be decreased to 10 kilobyte instead, and just only use the classes you used. And this idea of removing the unnecessary classes from Tailwind or the CSS itself, we call it normally Purge CSS, which is a tool that we can use it to remove all the CSS from the bundled CSS file if we don't use these classes. And we will see an example right now. I'm going to walk you through now the steps needed to install Tailwind CSS. The first step is you need to install or to create a project first and make sure you have package.json inside your project. And to do so, you need to run npm init-y. The next step is to install Tailwind CSS, post CSS, and auto prefixer. So Tailwind CSS, post CSS CLI, and auto prefixer. Now Tailwind CSS, you already know, post CSS CLI is used to compile the CSS and produce the final CSS output. Remember, Tailwind CSS is built using Sass or SASS, which you need to compile it in order to make it work on all browsers. So you need to use one of the compilers available, and one of them, or the easiest one to use, is post CSS CLI. Or it's actually post CSS, and you can refer to the documentation to read more about it if you want. Auto prefixer, on the other hand, is used to auto prefix all the CSS classes to work on any different browsers. So by default, Tailwind CSS will have the minimal browser supports, and auto prefixer will use those classes to make sure your CSS work will work on any browser, either Safari, Firefox, or Opera, or Google Chrome. Alright, the step number 3 is to generate the configuration for Tailwind, and this is optional. If you want to customize Tailwind, you can run this command npx tailwind css init, and then we can use that to extend its functionality or add another colors or change the internal color system. So to summarize, your project structure will look something like this. You have a public folder, which you will use it to have your index.html and actual the destination of your compilation, which is the CSS. And then you will have source folder, which contain the app.css, which contains all the Tailwind CSS directives. And then you'll have package.json, as always, tailwindcss.config.js, and also postcss.config.js. So step number 5 is you need to fill in the post.css config file with the required code, which will enable Tailwind CSS and auto prefixer to be compiled when you generate the destination file. Step number 6 is you need to write the directives of Tailwind CSS in your app.css, and then you can use post.cli to compile it and make sure it's available in the public directory. Finally, you need to run this command to compile your Tailwind CSS, and you can run that by using npx tailwind css build, and then you specify the input path and the output path. Alright, so let's take an example on how to install Tailwind CSS on both ways, using the CDN or using the npm. So if you go to tailwindcss.com, navigate to the documentation, and then go to the installation, scroll a little bit down to the end, you'll find this section using Tailwind CSS via CDN. And they recommended that you don't use it for production, you can use it only for development or testing. So for now, we are testing the application, we are testing Tailwind, so it's okay to copy this and just put it in the head, and then that's it. Your Tailwind CSS is available in your HTML, and you can verify that using some of the classes. So you say text red 500. Now, if we save it and open that in the browser, if we see the text in red, then it is a success sign that Tailwind CSS is already installed on the page. And yes, it does. So welcome to CSS, welcome to Tailwind CSS. If you want to change it to another color, you can choose text blue 500, and see now the text color will change to blue. So that's one way of installing Tailwind CSS, which again, as we said, it's not the recommended way. So let's take a look at the recommended way. And by the way, I have written an article. You can find it on my website, salim.dev. You can go to this article, Tailwind CSS Dark Mode, where basically I have written down all the steps you need to follow to install Tailwind. So you can just follow the steps very quickly and you can create the project and install Tailwind CSS. So the first step, as we said, is to run and generate the package.json. And you can do that using npm init-y. So I'm going to open the terminal inside VS Code. And then inside here, inside the test folder, I will run this command, npm init-y. This will generate a file called package.json. If we open this, you'll find it's just a JSON format or JSON file, contains key and value pairs. So the one we are interested in this file will be the dependencies, which will come later once we install Tailwind and other packages. So the next step is to install the needed dependencies. So what we need to do is to make sure the dependencies is installed by using this command, npm install Tailwind CSS post CSS auto prefixer. So let's run this command. And in the meanwhile, while this is installing, we need to create this structure. So we need a public folder, we need a source, and inside that CSS file, and then we need to create a file called app.css inside the source. So let's do that inside VS Code. I'm going to hide the terminal, and here I'm going to create two folders, sorry. One is the public, the second one is source, or we shorten it to be src, and then inside the src we can have another folder called css. You can customize this as you need. So in the css, I will create another file called app.css. All right. In the public folder, we need to shift this index and put it there, because this is where our final website will live. All right. Now the next step is, after we install these 3 steps, we need to install the post-CSS CLI to make sure we can work with the post-CSS compiler. So let's do that. And we have this -d flag to make it only for the development dependencies, not for the production dependencies. Step number 3 is we need to configure Tailwind CSS and post CSS. So the first one is we need to create this Tailwind CSS configuration. We can do that using this command, npx Tailwind CSS init. It is created, tailwind.config.js, and we can open this and we can see this is the basic configuration for Tailwind. All right, so here we can extend its color system, its variants and plugins, and anything we can do. Let's head back here and we can scroll a little bit down. The last step is to add Tailwind CSS directives into src css app.css. So we need these 3 lines to be added inside src css app.css. Just put it there, save the file, and close it. Close this tailwind.config.js, and the last step is we need to create this post.css.config.js. Copy that and make sure it's in the root folder of your project. Just put it there and just fill in this code. So model.exports and then the plugins you need. Okay? Now, step number 4 is you need to add this shortcut to run this command every time you need to compile the Tailwind CSS. So we're going to go and use the script tag inside the package.json. So what we need to achieve is this one. So copy this line and make sure it's available in the script inside package.json. In here, you can remove this test and just put yours, which is div, which will run, if you run this one, it will run this command. So it will compile the src css app.css and make sure it's output inside public and then app.css. Now, once you are ready, save the file and then run this command, npm run div, which ultimately will run this one. So open the terminal, run this one, and hopefully with any luck, we should see this command works and it will generate the public CSS file to be used inside index.html. And yes, indeed. So we have app.css is available here. We can add it as an external file to our index.html. Now remember, This is the link we use to include or to install Tailwind CSS using CDN. Now, since we install it using npm, we don't need this link. So we can remove it, and instead we say link, and then the path for this URL for that file, app.css, is available in the same directory. So all we have to do is say app.css, which will point to this file, right? Now, if we do everything correctly, if we save this file and come back to the browser, we should see the same result as before. So let's open that here. And yes, it does. It's in blue. To verify that, we can change this one to any other color. Let's say pink. If we save it and come back to the browser, yes, indeed, we have the pink color. All right. And that's how to install Tailwind CSS in a nutshell. This is the final step, is we need to link the app.css to our index.html.